Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's session on a better economics for climate change. This is actually the first in a series of three sessions that we're holding in collaboration between Rethink Economics India and the Pali project. The purpose of this collaboration and really today's session is to sort of more closely examine how gaps in discipline of economics have failed to address the problems posed by climate change, and also if that theory and background and really the tools that we have as economists have adequately prepared us to engage with solutions. Um, so with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We are joined by three really incredible people. We'll be having Dr. Jayati Ghosh, who taught economics at JNU for nearly 35 years and is now at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She's advised governments in India and other countries and consulted for several international organizations, including the ILO and UNDP, and is also the executive secretary of the International Development Economics Associates. We are also going to have Dr. Tejal Kanitkar, who is an associate professor at the School of Natural Sciences and Engineering at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, and was previously the chairperson at the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and her research focused in the area of energy, development, and climate policy. Last but not least, we have a final speaker who will be Sagar Dhara, who is a writer and researcher that looks at energy transformations and risk analysis, and is an environmental activist himself, but also advises people's movements on the environmental impacts of industry. He chooses to describe himself as a male, upper caste, upper class, college educated member of the most predatory species to walk the earth. So I'm going to sort of quickly go over the format of today's discussion. I'll outline and some of the rules of engagement. We'll be first having an opening statement by each of these speakers, after which I'll invite them to engage with what has been said and pose questions to one another. And then we'll be opening up for questions to the public. Throughout this session, you can leave your questions in the Q&A section and upvote the ones you'd like answered. And that will make it sort of easier for me to pick up on the ones to ask on your behalf. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And with all that being said, I'd like to ask Jyoti to now open up the floor and the discussion for us.
Thank you very much. It's really Karan, Jaya, and everybody else who's organized this. It is really a pleasure to be here. And I'm delighted that the Young Scholars Initiative in India is taking this particular issue up because I think it's so essential and there's too much that rests on it. I'm also very proud to be on this panel with the two people whose work I have respected from a distance, and it's nice to meet even if virtually. Okay, so what I really want to say is that what you're doing is absolutely critical because transforming economies essentially now also means transforming economics. Because let's face it, the mainstream discipline has actually become a barrier to our understanding of the problems, to our approach to the problems, and to the determination of policies. And unfortunately, too much official policy globally and nationally is determined by what is really a very uh, inadequate and I would say even counterproductive perspective. So, how does economics have to change? First of all, I would say that things that the discipline has seen in terms of externalities, that is, or non-market activities, have to actually become central to the understanding and internal to the study of the economy. Typically, all aspects of nature have also been seen in that category of, whether they generate positive or negative externalities, and that clearly is ridiculous. The costs of what we do. I mean, essentially, nature is seen in terms of costs and benefits also, but these costs are also not fully factored in, and I will explain how I mean what I mean by that in a minute. There's another aspect, of course, to economics which we totally ignore, and that has become very evident over the last 1 year, which is the recognition of unpaid work and the significance of the care economy. Everyone is now realizing how important it is from a societal perspective and even from a human survival perspective. But we still tend to not just undervalue and under recognize care work, but economics itself has a very, very poor conceptual way of dealing with care work and especially unpaid care work. Having said that, let's focus now on nature. Now, in fact, what both nature and care bring out, I think, very, very strongly, is how some notions that economists put forth really in the early to mid 20th century and have now become so entrenched that they appear to be written in stone, they have to change fundamentally. Okay, and one of them, most obviously, is the notion of GDP, national income, gross domestic product, or associated with, it's often treated as synonymous with economic activity, which of course we now know is not correct. GDP is deeply flawed as a concept, and yet it persists. Even today, we find that within the environmental economics paradigm, there's a discussion about green growth versus degrowth. And there's a fairly sharp debate about this. And yet everybody's taking for granted that growth, GDP growth, is the basic underlying thing that we're dealing with. And that either there is a trade-off or there isn't. The idea that GDP growth itself is not necessarily what we should be aiming for, which is so obvious that it should be hugely debunked, that is somehow not permeating. So let me just talk a little bit about this issue because I think it's absolutely central. And there are many other ways in which economics either does not appreciate the significance of the impact of nature on human activity and the impact of human activity on nature to uh, for the current and future. But I'll focus on this one because unfortunately we cannot seem to dislodge this wretched concept. Okay. Uh, what we all know that GDP essentially measures market activities, those that are paid for, and it ends up being this measure of value. There's a wonderful book by my friend Mariana Mazzucato. I hope all of you do read that. It's called The Value of Everything. And it touches on what we value and how economics has changed what we value in all kinds of wrong ways. So when we look at GDP, we are counting anything that generates more money. And of course, it's well known, right? First of all, there are those conceptual flaws. The famous one that was pointed out by George Bernard Shaw way back in the early 20th century, that if he married his housekeeper, GDP would fall, right? Because he would stop paying her. But then there are all kinds of other, let's consider if you have major, very, very unequal health systems rather than publicly provided health systems. They generate more GDP because people who can afford it will go to private hospitals and pay vast quantities of money. And the doctors and nurses and others there, well, not nurses, but often the specialist doctors will be getting much more revenue. But if you had a publicly provided, open access, good quality medical system, you would generate less GDP. The classic examples are Cuba versus typically most other developing countries that have very privatized health services. Similarly, if you have a polluting, congested, difficult, unequal system of privatized urban transport, as we have created in most of our cities, that generates much more GDP than a clean, green system of public transport that everyone can access, that doesn't charge very much, that is affordable, and that operates on greener principles. So, this idea that GDP is an indicator of human welfare is ridiculous, it's wrong. And the other angle that I want to emphasize, because again, we absorb these ideas without thinking about it, is that it gives us a completely flawed notion of productivity. How do we define productivity across countries? It's GDP per worker. First of all, we overcount or we wrongly estimate, this human welfare in the form of GDP. And then we don't count all workers. We don't count unpaid workers. We underpay a lot of very, very significant workers. So the notion of productivity is deeply flawed. And yet all economists are basically using these terms: GDP growth, productivity. Even when we're progressive, even when we're trying to transform the discipline, we end up using these terms. Why is it so difficult to dislodge? Essentially, it has become the sort of variable of choice for governments, for international organizations, for policymakers, and therefore for all of us. Even now in India, when we're talking about how the pandemic has impacted the economy, everybody's looking at the GDP indicator. And what's the response? It's, oh, look, we get it quarterly, we know what's going on. It's at least it's an indicator, a proxy for everything else. That's not true. GDP, the way it's measured, not just in India, but everywhere, but especially in India with so much informal work, is a complete guesstimate. If you actually go down deep and look into the kinds of estimates, guesses, projections that go into quarterly estimates of GDP, you would really not take that number seriously. And yet all of us do. All of us take it seriously when we debate green growth versus degrowth. We have to move away from it. The trouble is that whenever people like us try and suggest an alternative, we give a very complex alternative because we recognize complexity. Fine, that's good. But we end up giving, a dashboard or a matrix. We give many, many variables. And that doesn't grab policymakers or anybody else. To say, here are 27 variables that you can calculate, the multidimensional nature of human welfare. Fine, excellent, good. Even if you say here are 7, it's not going to work. You young people, you're the ones who can do it. You have to come up with something that actually replaces GDP in economic calculations. And I think that's absolutely central. The whole GDP thing was created in the mid 20th century for a very different time and in a very different context. And I think Kuznets and people who did it then would be alarmed at the way it is being used now. Okay, I've said a lot about this. I just want to focus. I wanted to highlight GDP as a particular example in terms of what you young people can do. And let me tell you, I'm so delighted at YSI and what it's doing in India and all over the world. I think you have a tremendous role to play, and in every way I can try and support you. I think all of us should do that. But I think you do have a really huge role. You can demand much more from the discipline, from your teachers, from your supervisors, from people who come up to you and say we're big economists, famous, blah blah. You have to demand much more. You have to question everything. And you have to keep your focus despite the fact that, let's face it, you're going to have to also make compromises, because this is a discipline with very strong gatekeepers. It's very hierarchical. It's very hard to get jobs. Let's not kid ourselves. It's hard to get published unless you go with the flow, do the mainstream stuff. So many of you will have to do that. I'm not saying you don't do it. I'm saying keep that other focus. Don't lose that focus. Don't forget why you want to study this thing in the first place, how you want to change it, and just keep at it. Okay, I think I've said too much already. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much for that, Jayati. I think we can now move to Tejal. Yes, over to you.
Hi. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Jayati, for that the great opening salvo, because it sort of helps in what I had planned to say. Very grateful to be invited as a panelist here, but as I was telling the organizers that I'm not an economist. I have no training in the discipline. I've worked, at the margins of the discipline, maybe since I started working on climate change. I'm actually an engineer. So as I was telling them, that should be a red flag. To get an engineer to talk about economics is not necessarily a very good thing. But I try and, not keep to the stereotype. But let's see how well I can do that. So, from the time, and my work really is on, so I'll focus on climate change and the economics of climate change, and what I believe is a central problem that we face there in terms of policy, especially in terms of how we deal with the subject from the global south. Because that's really a very important aspect of the debate in climate change. And from the time that the academic community began working on the problem of climate change, economics has been an important element in the development of knowledge on climate change. While climate science has, of course, been very much a part of the entire story of what we know about climate change, the role of economists has really been quite important. William Nordhaus, who got the Economics Prize in 2018 for his work on integrating climate change into long-run macroeconomic analysis, is in fact often also credited for the introduction of this 2 degrees Celsius target into policy discussions. The fact that we need to limit temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius. And I always do this exercise with my students. I ask them in class, they have wondered where this 2 degrees Celsius comes from. Why 2 degrees Celsius? Why not 2.2? Why not 1.8? What is so special about 2 degrees? Is it a scientific determination of a tipping point, so the level of temperature rise beyond which we will begin to see reversible changes in the world's climatic system. Now, if so, it is a very beautiful result to arrive at, right? I mean, such a precise integer value for the level to which we must restrict temperature rise, and arrived at through modeling atmospheric and biospheric systems that are so complex, we don't even know how to fully and accurately model them yet. Rarely do we get such beautiful numbers, such beautiful results that represent the limit beyond which lies catastrophe. But if you actually look at some of the articles, they trace the origin of this 2 degrees Celsius limit on temperature rise back to this sort of a back of the envelope calculation done by William Nordhaus. It became, of course, I mean, there's much more now to it than simply that. It became more official after the EU endorsed the target in 1996. It entered into the formal UNFCCC documents of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change only in 2009 with the Copenhagen Accord, if I'm not mistaken. But that target itself has its origins, at least partly, in the idea of what a manageable cost of climate change would be. What is this manageable cost? What would be the cost of not reducing emissions versus what the cost of reducing emissions would be? So Nordhaus's DICE model, for example, is the first in the series of integrated assessment models that dominate climate change economics. This incorporates this idea of optimizing climate action and by maximizing welfare across space and time. The key control variables here are the marginal cost of abatement, the cost of reducing 1 ton of carbon dioxide, and the cost of damages due to temperature rise, measured in terms of foregone economic output because of temperature rise. So minimizing the social cost of carbon is an essential element of these models. And there have been many criticisms, of course, of the integrated assessment models from a mathematical standpoint, what such a complex nonlinear model means, etc., whether you can actually predict economic outcomes 100 years into the future. That's what these models do. We are talking about GDP, and Jayati just spoke about GDP itself as a concept, and nobody would have predicted what the GDP, I mean, it's damn difficult to do even for 5 years into the future. I mean, who thought the pandemic is going to result in the loss of GDP, given even all the problems with GDP, even using that measure, there's even that no model, I think, would have predicted. Yet here we have climate models, integrated assessment models for climate change that are predicting economic outcomes 100 years, 150 years, sometimes 200 years into the future. I mean, that's quite fantastic, really. So there's a lot of criticism of this. And in 2003, Stephen DeCanio published a book. That book is entirely dedicated to critiquing the economic models of climate change. And he undertakes a very comprehensive critique of the use of general equilibrium models for this purpose, the economic component of these integrated assessment models. So, I mean, I'll read out a small excerpt from the preface of the book. There is a section on neoclassical general equilibrium models there, and that's a forward that he has to this book. And it actually nicely sort of captures the major criticisms that he has then detailed in the book. And I recommend the book to any student of climate change or natural resource economics. He says, instead of contributing its legitimate insights on the effects of various incentives, the interactions between different parts of the system, and the overriding importance of the distribution of wealth, economics has been misused to obfuscate the climate debate. Economic models have been invoked to claim a knowledge of causes and consequences, of costs and benefits, and of the specifics of optimal policies that are entirely beyond their grasp. Models routinely used in a policy arena involve forecasts and projections extending decades into the future. But in reality, no economic forecasting techniques has any hope of embodying about circumstances that far ahead. Models are used to compare policy alternatives, but the fundamental principles of economics make those models incapable of carrying out the requisite comparisons. Models are claimed to represent economic and social reality, despite the fact that it is known that they omit ignore or mischaracterize vast segments of that reality. Models are used to make strong statements about which policies should or should not be undertaken, even though it is known that at their foundations, the mathematical properties of the models preclude drawing welfare conclusions. So that's quite a scathing critique of economic models. Despite this, the integrated assessment models of this variety continue to dominate the field of climate change economics. The models that have been reviewed for use by the IPCC, for example, the IPCC's working group, everybody thinks IPCC is a body that collates information on climate science. There's only working group 1 and 2 that do that. Working group 3 is climate policy, and that's largely literature that is produced by the community that works on climate change mitigation, climate policy, energy policy, etc. So there's a lot of economic modeling that happens there in working group 3, the IPCC. So they've reviewed the use by the IPCC 19 integrated assessment models, most of which predict economic outcomes and emissions to about 100 years into the future, like I said. So that is one big issue. I mean, there's already this list of issues that Tikani has listed in his book, and there are other critiques as well of this. And the other, in my opinion, most important element that is missing from all of these ways of measuring climate impact, etc., is there is absolutely no consideration of equity. It's the one thing that has an overwhelming presence actually in the climate debate. If you look at the negotiations at the UNFCCC, the overall debate in civil society as well, equity is really central. Climate justice is really central to the debate and discussions on climate change. And yet, a lot of the academic literature on economics in climate change actually ignores this, or comes at it in some vague way, which essentially means that it is not handled. So that there's a role of climate science is to explain the relationship between emissions, radiative forcing, temperature, etc., the particular nature of the interaction of GHGs with atmospheric phenomenon. But there is a vast area of the interaction of our economic systems of production, the political structure within which they function, and the nature of their relationship with energy use, emissions, etc., that is equally, if not more complex to understand. And yes, yet the discussion on the latter has been dominated, unfortunately, by economists and engineers who, as a matter of disciplinary orthodoxy, value efficiency much more over equity. So you see an overwhelming presence of productivity, efficiency, etc., these measures in the literature, whereas something like equity is really not very much a part of it. And this creates a glaring divide between the literature on the subject and the debates and the discussions, the actual political contestations that are happening on the ground. So, because at the very crux of the climate change issue, like I said, lies the issue of both intergenerational equity, something that the sustainability, the concept of sustainability tries to address, right? Equity between generations, as well as intragenerational equity between nations, within nations, between different sections of the population, etc. Yet, present-day climate change economics either completely ignores this issue or circumvents it, like I said. And I think I'll end by sort of highlighting one last issue that I think is very important. And because we've not really, I think, from within the discipline as well as in generally in the debate on climate change, people working in academia on climate change have to understand this. The scholarship, especially in the global south today, is mimicking the scholarship on climate change in the global north. And I think that is a big problem, because not only do we sort of, there are critiques of this that sort of say that, we'll make the same mistakes that they did. I think at very superficially, that might be the problem, but it's a bigger problem in that sense for us, because even making the same mistakes that they did, we are not going to get as rich as they did making those mistakes. We are going to make those mistakes and remain poor, which is even worse. So I think we should really think of this quite seriously. Right? So, the last issue that I said that I wanted to focus on was this thing of, shared socio-economic pathways. This is this new big thing that we will see. The IPCC's 6th assessment report is now going to be coming out soon. And the shared socio-economic pathways are very much going to be a part of this. What are these? These are model pathways which describe how socio-economic factors, including population, economic growth, education, urbanization, and related technological development may change in the future, and how these would impact climate change variables. So you come up with a set of scenarios, emission scenarios that they're supposed to have feedback, you have adaptation, mitigation, everything under the sun, under one grand model, sort of model scenario. And, trade between nations, et cetera, et cetera. You think of it, it's there in the, except equity, of course, everything else is there in the scenario. These are not drawn independently developed and implemented research programs and agendas. They represent a specific codification of the modeled emissions and pathways that are put together by a set of research teams that work within the scope of the activities of the IPCC. So in that sense, they're very different from independent researchers and literature from them being collated. And these, like I said, are built using integrated assessment models. And some of these issues I have already highlighted. So one of the things, going back to what Jayati said, that the way in which they sort of try and, so there is one scenario there, for example, which is called the SSP1. Now, this is supposed to be an equitable green scenario where you have everything. You have low emissions, so low mitigation burden, low adaptation burden, you have green technology, everybody is cooperating with everybody else, there is no imperialism, everybody is happy, and we have equity, we have no poverty, there are no trade-offs basically, so everything is happy, and you actually have such a scenario possible while keeping limiting temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius in this world. So how do they model this? Of course, a lot of this is black box. You don't really know what happens inside the model, other than the fact that you know that it's a set of production functions, that have assumed some amount of productivity improvement, some amount of some elasticity of substitution between different inputs, and so on, and into the future, like I said, for 150 years. And they talk about equity here. Here, when equity does make an appearance, in terms of some parity between nations, it is not implemented in carbon or emissions variables. So we're not talking about equal emissions or equal right to the global atmospheric commons or something like that, but it's implemented in terms of economic variables. And even here, they are not based on outcome variables such as HDI or something like that. It's only a single process variable, that is the GDP growth rate, which is used. And equity is claimed to be incorporated through the conversions of the rates of GDP growth across different regions. That's how they do it. And even this conversion, so how soon are the developed countries to come close to GDP, the levels of GDP of the developing countries, to come close to the GDP levels of the developed countries? As late as 2125, that's more than 100 years into the future, we will achieve the same levels of GDP as the developed countries. So this is what is modeled into scenarios of the SSPs. And this is what, we are going to soon see coming into the IPCC literature. I mean, there are a lot of other criticisms here, but, I'm out of time, so I'm not going to go into all of it. I'll just end by saying that, like Jayati said, I think so much of the focus is on GDP, etc. A lot of these, the mainstream, the discipline itself, and most of the work that's happening within the discipline, what it does, and when we sort of, from the global south, like I say, simply sort of adopt some of these approaches and methodologies and use it, what this does is it undermines the need for production, for infrastructure, for energy services in developing countries, and the challenges posed by climate change to the realization of all of these developmental needs. The IIMs do not keep track of variables like physical capital stock that are relevant to ensure that growth rates are compatible, even if you're looking at growth rates. Growth rates are compatible with the material well-being and needs of your population, whether they're being met in a sustainable manner. Intersectoral linkages are not taken into consideration. And I want to end by saying that the last point is unfortunately also a problem with many of the critics of the mainstream discourse on climate change economics, especially those who argue for degrowth or decentralization or focus uncritically on consumption alone. right? What happens to the need to create employment, to build housing, provide healthcare? All of these are essential elements of how we must see what the challenges we face, in the future are, especially now with climate change, right? Even if we look at them as measures to increase the resilience of our people against the impacts that we are going to see of climate change. But I'm not going to go into the debates of degrowth and things like that, etc. But I would want to emphasize, and maybe the question answer session can cover this. But there are also problems with these arguments because they do not consider the specific nature of the problem in the global south. A lot of this is not centric. The critique is not centric. Fossil fuel use, consumption, etc. I mean, 10% of India's population consumes. The remaining 90% is in dire straits. I mean, who are we talking about? We can go on and on about that one Ambani, but it doesn't really, I mean, that's not real, that shouldn't really be the focus of the conversation. The focus of the conversation should be the remaining, 90% of the population. So, I mean, I think, that's all I really want to say at this point. I think climate justice is a very necessary element of addressing the problem of climate change. And when we speak of rethinking climate change economics, the means to introduce some of these debates in the curricula on climate change. I mean, I agree with Jayati that, our students have to go out, get jobs. We have to publish, I'm still in very much a part of this entire, if I need to stay in academia, I need to publish. And it's very difficult to publish anything critical of renewable energy. It's very, even within the scope of climate change, it's very difficult to get things published now if you're going against what's the accepted, wisdom on this. So they need to do this, but I think some of these debates need to be introduced in the curricula itself on climate change, on ecology, to at least know that you're equipping students for the bigger fights. You're not just equipping them to get jobs, but you're equipping them for the bigger fights that we're going to see in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tejal. That was beautiful. So just like a short reminder to all attendees to keep putting questions in the chat. And now I'd like to pass it on to Sagar. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Jayati and Tejal. You've made my life a little easier. But I'm going to foreground this by saying that, like Tejal, I'm an engineer basically by training, as well as spent long years actually working as an engineer, as an environmental engineer, and then started drifting into a whole lot of fields. And well, I'm trying to find my way now, and try to integrate what I have learned and practiced and, the kind of problems I see today. Normally, if somebody had asked me to talk on climate change, I would jump and say, okay, X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3. But I tried to change this entire presentation to suit what the organizers told me and tried to hive in what I understand of economics and the problems that I see. So I am going to touch on climate change, but it's going to be a little more on the way that I see problems with economics and its ability or inability to really come up and be able to solve problems of climate change or peak oil or inequality or things of that sort. Can I show a few slides?
Yeah.
This is what I asked the organizers. Otherwise, I can just speak. But the slides will make it a little easier for people to understand.
Yeah, so I've given you permission. I think you can just share screen.
Okay.
Should be able to. Yeah.
Right. Right. Okay. Let me start with the story, which is okay. Something like about 25 years back, Karnataka government wanted to put up a power plant somewhere close to Udupi. And somehow I ended up doing the EIA for NTPC, and I wrote a 700-page tome, which NTPC didn't like, and it threw it out of the window. It said, listen, you've written a research paper, something of that sort. And they presented an absolutely useless EIA report, but they got their clearance. The problem was that this was in an extremely ecologically sensitive area. And subsequently, when I started doing some studies around different power plants, I found that, if you look at this particular plant in Udupi, it was going to generate 1200 megawatts, 90% of which was for Bangalore, and the remaining 10% would be sold locally. Now, what we did was we actually measured crop yield losses around several power plants and applied it to this particular plant. And much to our horror, we found that as against, 10% of its capacity being sold locally, the local farmers were losing as much as 15% of the plant's capacity in terms of just crop yield loss. Mind you, there are several other impacts. There are impacts on health, there are impacts on structures. I won't even get into all that. So basically, when the farmers of this area went to meet Kumaraswamy, the then chief minister, they took me along as their technical advisor. And I basically told Kumaraswamy, what you're basically doing is theft. You are stealing from the local farmers and giving it to Bangalore. And in addition to that, actually, if you put the plant close to Bangalore, the additional cost of carrying coal from Bangalore to Bangalore would be equal to the capital cost of the plant over a 30-year period. So in short, the fight there was a one-sided fight. And of course, the farmers lost the fight. They were able to see that the plant didn't come for nearly about 15 years. But after 15 years, where the plant came in, when the farmers' agitation went down. The same thing happened in Kudigi, an area which is pretty close to Bijapur. And even then, I, on behalf of Karnataka Raju Raitu Sangha, met Siddaramaiah and said, what you're going to do is, the plant is basically going to, make Gold Gumbaz drop dead in about 20 to 25 years because of the acid gases. He said, tell me what to do, and so on. We told him. I won't get into all those stories, but he obviously refused to, do what we suggested that you do. Now, essentially, when you look at the whole relationship between these kinds of struggles and the government or the utility that sets up a plant, the farmers invariably lose. Except in Sompeta and Kakarpalli, just about every other fight that I've seen, they've lost. Why does this happen? So when you look at it in a fundamental kind of a way, it's because in a problem, wherever you have a energy conversion issue and the fuel that you're using is largely sunlight, there is always a difference between the thermodynamic equation and the economic equation. Because what happens is that the amount of energy that really goes into making a crop is not factored in terms of the cost. So supposing, there is 50 megajoules of energy that goes in as sunlight and 50 megajoules that goes in as XYZ other energy inputs. And you have an output of 100 megajoules. In a thermodynamic equation, the left-hand side of the equation has to be equal to the right-hand side of the equation. Now, if I take the same production process and cost it out, what happens is that the sunlight is never costed. Whatever the reasons be, we will get into that much later. But ultimately what happens is that that sunlight is left out, and the price that is paid out, or the value of the product that is paid out, leaves out the sunlight. So any energy for which there is no energy that is put in to get it is not included. And therefore, there is a fundamental difference between a thermodynamic equation and an economic equation, particularly when it comes to energy resources which are uncosted, which is the direction, obviously, that we will have to go towards if we want to become more sustainable. So fundamentally, what economics and the value computations that are done are acting against, in fact, the argument of sustainability itself. So there are two things that happen out here. One is by not valuing what nature is giving you, which is what we should really be doing. We don't value, for example, air till till about 20 years back, we didn't even value water. You know, we don't value sunlight, and this is precisely the kind of direction that we need to go into. What economics is basically doing, as I understand it, is that it has gone in the direction of actually propping up anthropocentrism, which is exactly what needs to be actually dismantled if we want to become sustainable. Unfortunately, anthropocentrism is something like almost 3 to 4 thousand years old. You can't dismantle it immediately. It is propped up by a whole lot of thought systems. So it's not that easy to do it. The second thing that happens out here in this difference between a thermodynamic and an economic equation is it creates an unequal exchange between those who use free of cost energy like sunlight and those who use costed energy like fossil fuels or nuclear energy or what have you. And this is in fact one of the fundamental problems that I see as being the problem between, for example, agriculture and the industrial sector. Okay, we'll again get into that a little later. Finally, anthropocentrism, what it does is it creates a culture of violence, because when we back computed what is the energy cost of having deforested one third of our forests as of 8,000 years ago, low. It's the amount of energy that we've spent per year in deforesting. For the last 8,000 years, each year we've spent 20,000, the energy in 20,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. This is the culture of violence that we've got into. So the first problem is this whole dichotomy between an thermodynamic equation and uh, economic equation. The second problem is the problem of growth. Now, it took me a while, a couple of years back, to get all this data, and what I did was basically computed what is the growth of population and energy ever since Christ was born, and GDP. And till 1800, all three had the same growth rate, which is about 0.1% per annum. Now, after 1800, after fossil fuels come in, the growth rate of energy and population is approximately 1.1 to 1.4%, and that of GDP is 2.4%. Again, I won't get into explaining why these differences. I've done it in some paper somewhere else, but what you see is a sudden jump in this whole issue of growth. Now, growth has limits, and people have been now talking about it ever since the Club of Rome report was written in the early 70s and debating it. Now, the first thing that we do know in this whole problem is that fossil fuels are going out of the window within this century itself. Oil first, within another 40 to 50 years, gas in another 60 years at most, even if we count in shale, and coal definitely within 100 years. And there is no replacement, which is going to replace fossil fuels, which gives us approximately 80% of our current commercial energy. Okay? Not PV, not biomass, not nuclear energy. They cannot do it. Okay, fine. So what is the set of problems that we have today? We have three problems with us. Okay, we've used too much because of energy, which is obviously limited. We have also used too much of materials, and we've hit a situation where basically energy the fossil fuels are going out of the window shortly, and a whole lot of non-renewable minerals, including iron and copper and XYZ, are going to become scarce between 30 to 70 years. A lot of people think that, oh, PV is a good replacement and things like that. Copper, which is used in every electrical system for that matter, is going to become scarce within 40 to 50 years. So even if you're able to build PV panels and things of that sort, and a part of the PV panel, a small fraction of the PV panels are going to go out of the window again, because things like tellurium and cadmium are going to be in short supply in 30 years. Okay, so you have a range of things which are going to get into short supply, which is, if you look at the production system, which is that you take raw materials, many raw materials are going to become scarce, energy and non-renewable materials. The second part of the whole production system is the actual production of goods and services, and that is where for the last 5,000 years we've had enormous amount of inequality being generated. And from what at least my reading is that this inequality now is only growing. Okay. And the third, which is obviously you produce something, you're going to have wastes, and you're going to have waste energy, and you're going to have waste material. As long as the environment could absorb some of this waste, it was not an issue. As long as we have our production systems were small, getting raw materials were not an issue. But at these two ends of the entire production system, raw materials are getting scarce, and basically we are running into problems like environmental problems, not just at the local level, where water contamination has happened. For example, in the Yamuna, I lived many years in Delhi, and till today, they have not been able to solve, for example, the air pollution problem. Uh, all of them are good friends of mine in CPCB or the Ministry of Environment and what have you. They have not, because they're barking up the wrong tree altogether. And when you point this out to them, they're not willing to accept the kind of solutions that we have offered them. So at the other end, you not only have local problems like Delhi air pollution or the Yamuna getting contaminated or something of that sort, but you have now regional environmental issues like the atmospheric brown cloud, which is a huge cloud which encompasses South Asia at this time of the year. And of course, you have carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere and causing global warming. So we have three problems. One is resource depletion. So the second is, like I said, it's not just fuels, but also a lot of other materials. The second is inequality. And the third is climate change. And economics so far has not been able to, one of the points that you wanted to really highlight upon, as far as I have understood, whatever limited economics that I have had to deal with, has not been able to deal with these three tipping points, any one of which can regress or even collapse society. And recent research, in fact, is indicating that there have been entire civilizations which have collapsed in the past because of energy depletion, like the Mayan civilization and so on and so forth. So I will leave you with these thoughts and say that we need to rethink completely as to what is sustainability and what is the meaning of equality. And we need to rethink our very relationship with nature. Do we do gain maximization for a few, or do we attempt to go towards risk minimization for all? And then if I add, it should be risk minimization for all species, then economics will have to be reinvented. Because as I understand it, theory of value starts failing at that point of time. Okay. Now, without again getting into details, to me, there seem to be two extremely broad issues that we need to think about very, very seriously. One is the need to power down, and our computations indicate that our energy consumption, regardless of what the source is, needs to come down by something like about 55 to 60%. And I have read papers which by scientists, mind you, which indicate that we actually need to come down by 90%. Okay, and the other is quite obviously equity. Now, out here, there is another issue. Okay, I didn't put a slide in. Somewhere that slide got lost, which is the concept of ownership. Now, other species don't have obviously a concept called. The example I will give you is there is a term called EROEI, energy return on energy invested. It's very similar to putting money into a bank. I put in some money and I get some interest, like 5% or whatever it is. Now, EROEI is if I invest 1 joule, I can get 30 joules is my profit. Okay. Now, the minute I put a fence around the coal mine, whether I be the state or whether I be an individual, because I have only spent that 1 joule to find that coal and produce it, I claim that the entire remaining 29 joules is mine. Where did this concept of ownership come from? Because the fundamental question that needs to be asked is who made the coal in the first place? Does it belong to us? or does it belong to that entity that made the coal, which is nature? So this is another issue that is not a pure economic issue because it transcends economics, which we need to really ask and attempt to answer, because the whole problem of growth is partly hinged on this question of accumulation of surplus. I'm going to end here, and though I know that the kind of concepts I'm dealing with probably require a greater amount of time to sort of explore, I'm going to sort of end here and leave it for further explanation in the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sagar, and all of the speakers for your responses. So we are going to move to questions in a bit. I think there are already people upvoting the ones they like. But I kind of want to open to follow up. If any of the panelists would like to follow up any of the points that were mentioned, or any like additional comments you'd like to make.
I just want to make one comment on the two excellent presentations we just heard, which is that for you economists out there, isn't it fascinating that the best, most interesting, and most insightful analyses of this come from engineers and not economists?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think very well placed. Tejal and Sagar, would you want to add any comments?
I think, there are quite a lot of interesting questions that have already been put there. And I think it's going to take us all our time to sort of probably address them. So maybe let's keep time for that.
All right. So I will then move to the Q&A. I think one is sort of posed to all panelists. That would be it would be great to hear your comments on rethinking global governance, since climate is a global issue and international institutions and governance structure play an important role in its mitigation. And do you have any comments? So it's addressed to all panelists. So maybe one of you would want to volunteer to go first.
Okay, let me go first, because I think several of the other questions are specifically directed to Tejal and Sagar. So look, I mean, the point about global governance is really, Sagar put it in his last slide, right? It's power. There is a whole question. Everything we're talking about is also very, very strongly related to power. I mean, Sagar mentioned the power of humanity versus nature, or, the Anthropocene rather. There's the power across classes. There's the power of particular governments who are also, let us say, influenced by the lobbying of corporate bodies and so on. So you cannot look at global governance as a sort of thing, as a technocratic thing. It's very much all about unequal distribution of power and how that shifts over time. So a lot of why global governance, as we call it, or international cooperation, coordination, whatever you want to like, is failing, has to do with the fact that essentially it's not even that countries say that this is in my interest and that's in their interest. It is that corporate bodies see that certain things are in their interest and not in others. So we often, misplace it. We say the US is doing this, or India is doing that, or Brazil is asking for this, whereas it is really a particular state demanding something which is often driven by the corporate interests of that particular, in that region. That's where we have to really think of a slightly different framework for mobilizing. Certainly, you have to influence how your state interacts in the global negotiating, but that's very, very difficult because, as we know, a lot of these negotiations are semi-secret. A lot of the governance structures are declared to be written in stone, whereas actually they're based in legal codes which are effectively written in the city of London and in New York. So we have to certainly try and influence how our nation states behave, both in the international negotiations and domestically. But we also have to have, I think, much stronger international links, which bring out how things that are presented as international negotiations are really the outcome of lobbying power of corporates across the world. And they are very international, they are very cartelized, they tend to work together. You cannot achieve change in global structures without the rest of us working together. So I think, how do we get the change? You have to actually be willing to work within your own local state, as Sagar mentioned, the nation state, but also internationally, and make it clear to everybody that, it's not necessarily that governments are always representing even their own people's interests. And certainly they're not representing intergenerational interests, as Tejal mentioned, and so on. So obviously the global architecture right now is not fit for purpose. We tend to put too much emphasis on what I would call the form. The fact that you have meetings in Paris, or you have people signing on to particular treaties and so on. That's really, I would say, it's not meaningless, but it's the lesser part of the problem. I want to reiterate, the bigger part of the problem is the legal structures that have been put in place in the City of London and New York. And I cannot underplay the significance of that. I mean, I cannot overemphasize the significance of that. We don't even realize, even in terms of environment, how much of the ability of states to respond even to domestic pressure is affected by those legal structures, which are not even designed internationally. They're designed in these two locations for the benefit of global capital, particularly finance capital, but in general. Okay, let me just end there. Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question, I think this was also addressed to all, but to what extent
can I respond very quickly to this?
Yes, sorry, sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have been, as a technical advisor, I've sat in on COP meetings in the UN. What Jayati says is absolutely right. And the only way then is you have to build people's organizations, and it doesn't have to be one single organization. It can be several organizations. Broadly speaking, they should be on the same page. Of course, there will be a lot of differences, when it comes to local issues. But without that, you don't have a hope in hell of being able to influence the way things happen in the UN or in IPCC negotiations and things of this sort. So the only way to do this thing is to build it grassroots level upwards. And you need two sets of people. First, you require mass organizations to be able to do this, whether they're organized, unorganized, semi-organized, unorganized labor. And many of my friends now have started beginning in trade unions, have begun to realize this and are getting out into the migrant labor, that has shifted to many parts of the country. They are beginning to go into rural areas and beginning to articulate issues like, why don't farmers ask for carbon dioxide compensation? It actually amounts to 1 lakh crores compensation per annum. In fact, the carbon dioxide that is sequestered by the farmers, just that of the cities, mind you. And the other is scientists, scientists who are willing to work with people, not scientists who are willing to merely say, oh, I know it all. Like my mentor once told me, a scientist's job is only to advise. And the decisions have to be taken by policy people who make policy. And that has to shift from bureaucrats and technocrats and politicians now to people. Without that, I don't see any other way out. The only other road is collapse.
All right.
Can I also say something? Because I have a slightly different opinion on the climate change negotiations per se. I think the climate change negotiations, I mean, I agree with the fact that, there is power is a big thing. I spoke about the global north and the global south myself. The climate change negotiations have been very peculiar in the sense that, we have the UNFCCC coming into force in 1992. This is a time when the world order was changing. This, the collapse of the Soviet Union, change in economic policies the world over. And yet you have a document that has a very different understanding of equity as compared to a lot of the other things that were the WTO, documents, etc., that were there. It has a very progressive understanding of equity that recognizes historical responsibility, that recognizes differentiation, that recognizes that countries do not begin from the same, the same starting line. We are differently placed. And that is, I think, also because of the nature of the problem and the mobilization around the problem, conservation, pollution, etc., that had happened for many years before the UNFCCC came into power. It's not I mean, unlike a lot of the other issues in which there were multilateral negotiations, climate change specifically, and that's why you see the negotiations also, the COPs also are very different. You have protests going on as as the intergovernmental discussions happen. However, things have changed. I'm not saying that they haven't. That things have changed in the last 30 years, and there has been a significant shift in terms of the voices at the COP. But this is also, I mean, be very careful that it's not just corporate interests. I mean, corporate interests also is, there is a very broad sort of reach that these have. A lot of countries have their nationally determined contributions, their pledges to mitigate climate change, written by DFID, by USAID, by all of these funding organizations. Organizations like the WRI, etc., are not some objective, value neutral, nice benevolent NGOs sitting there and working. There is a specific agenda that drives some of these. So even global civil society organizations. And there is also, like I said, it doesn't work it's not some big conspiracy theory. That's not what I'm alleging. But it works in a way in which, I mean, it actually demonstrates how a dominant political ideology eventually sort of influences, every sphere. So you have academics also. So therefore, even the IPCC negotiations, it's an intergovernmental panel. So there are negotiations on how the summary for policymakers gets drafted. Even those are extremely contested between scholars from the global south and global north. I mean, there is a push to ignore certain literature, to give importance or sort of highlight certain literature, even in the IPCC. So it's not, like I said, it's a benign exercise. So there is definitely, I mean, I agree that mass organizations have to be, trade unions have to play a role. The ILO is present at the climate change negotiations, but really marginalized to a large extent. But it's also important to remember that things like gender justice, indigenous rights, have become big buzzwords in the climate change negotiations now. And part of it is also a way in which the organizations have worked, mobilizations have worked. They've managed to get these issues on board. But nevertheless, they have come at the cost. I mean, you have everybody at the negotiations agreeing to gender justice, agreeing to indigenous rights, while disagreeing with any kind of equality between nations, denying developing countries their due rights. So the most marginalized sections of the indigenous people, of women in developing countries, actually, you are disadvantaging by the overall agenda in the negotiations, while still paying lip service to some of these things. So I think those, some of these issues are also complex, and we need to make sure that we understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Tejal. I think this next question is also for you. And I think it's in response to how you mentioned the modeling and how that gives inputs to policy alternatives. But how does neoclassical economics define energy as an input alongside labor and capital to the production process, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's become a much more regular practice than it was. I mean, Jayati can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it has become a much more, so you have labor and capital as inputs, and you have land sometimes added on to labor and capital when it's not considered separately in terms of rent, but you have now energy also added into the as an input. It doesn't become a sector separately. It's not considered as a separate sector like agriculture, industry, etc., which it actually is, because there is labor and capital input going into energy. Energy doesn't it doesn't sort of appear out of nowhere. Coal and all of these things, while they are in the ground, mean nothing. It's only after they're extracted and utilized and there's labor and capital input that goes into it that they become forms of energy that can then be used as inputs to production. They're part of their input to producing commodities, but they're also commodities themselves. So this entire understanding that they can be used as an input is a bit problematic, in my opinion. It's done, however, because you don't simply want an output in value terms. See, because emissions is a physical entity, you want to know how many tons of carbon dioxide. You can't get that. You don't just want to know how many rupees per ton of carbon dioxide. You want to know how many tons of carbon dioxide. That's what helps you connect it through the planetary boundary that Sagar spoke about in terms of how much emissions you can emit, how it leads to temperature rise and so on. And so if you separate it out, you can then convert it into its physical units, how many joules of energy, then how many joules of energy from coal, how many from solar, from wind, and so on and so forth. So mathematically, it makes it, I mean, I know of ways to do it, and I'm sure therefore everybody knows of ways to do it, even without considering this as a separate input alongside labor and capital. Although in a lot of models, they do it. I'm probably being generous by saying that they do it to convert it to physical units, but in my opinion, it's not necessary, and in fact, it is wrong. I mean, I won't even say it is. They do it for whatever reason. I would say that it is wrong. I mean, I leave Jayati to answer that if I'm mistaken.
Okay, can I jump in?
Yeah.
On this one? Yeah, ever since I started getting into the subject of energetics, which is different from energy, because energetics looks at energy flows and what it does to a system. And I started particularly looking at energetics of human society. I started one of my presentations in a history department of a university by saying, the way I was taught history was like, reading a railway timetable. That some king came and he did a little bit of good and a little bit of bad and he moved on. I said, that is not what I understand in history as anymore. I understand history as the history of energy conversion, and all of us are big players. And I'm talking about both the history of nature, that is natural history, as well as social history, history of human society. And the more and more I got into this subject, I think energy has to be looked at very differently from every other substance, every other matter. Let me put it that way. If there is no energy flow, there is no life. If there is no energy flow, there is absolutely everything comes to what is called a dead state. So energy is something that will have to be dealt with as a completely separate entity, which is the mover and shaker of the entire universe, leave aside being the mover and shaker of human society. Okay, there is stuff I've written in the past on, the role that energy has played, for example, in primitive agriculture and settled agriculture and industrialism and all these kinds of things. It is central and fundamental to the universe. Everything is dependent on energy flow. And therefore, to treat it as just one more commodity, I think is a very wrong way of looking at this whole issue.
All right. I think
I just want to add one more thing. If you look at the
sorry.
history of human society, actually the entire process of human history is in fact a search for energy and a control of energy. Politics is nothing but an attempt to control energy, in fact. Um, you can explain migration as it happened from 70,000 years ago, ever since humans came out of Africa, till recent times, till they went into the Americas, in terms of their search for energy. Wars, for example, are energy wars. Why did Japan go to Indonesia and not to Singapore after they bombed Pearl Harbor? Because Indonesia has basically it has gas, it has oil. Okay? Why did Hitler try to move towards Baku? He tried because basically if he got Baku, then the whole plan was actually to move the German army all the way to India and meet up with the Japanese army here in India. So there is a tremendous amount you can start understanding if you start using energy as a category, which is fundamental. Even the whole labor process, in fact, is nothing but energy conversion. A human body is nothing but a heat engine. The economy is nothing but a heat engine. So thermodynamics becomes an extremely important subject now, to understand, in fact, economies. And I think to that extent, the ecological economists are trying to do just that today.
I must say, as an engineer and a student of thermodynamics myself, I am thoroughly in disagreement with what Sagar said. But it's a long debate, and we can have that maybe some other time when we have time.
Thank you. I think our next question is for Jayati. So unlike developed countries where the pressure to mitigate emissions from the private sector, we have a larger public sector responsibility for emissions as well as ensuring equitable energy access in India. And how do we make the public sector then more responsible to deal with these issues?
Yeah, sure. This is a very big issue. But by the way, it's not only in India. I mean, even in advanced economies, government agencies, public sector plays a very big role in a lot of the more concerning practices with regard to energy, ecology, environment, nature, and so on. So how do we make the government more responsive? I mean, ultimately, it is essentially pressure, mobilization, greater public awareness, greater insistence, greater recognition that what are often presented as trade-offs are not really trade-offs, especially if you take into account the distributional aspects that Tejal mentioned. So look, I mean, just to go back to this underlying theme of power, you see, it's not necessarily that the private sector is all bad and generally only considering the things of big corporates, and the public sector is all good. How the public sector behaves is also a reflection of relative power. And of course, orientation as well. So it's not the case that state action is always necessarily going to be towards what we could broadly call the public purpose. It has to be made to accord with the public purpose. The notion of the public purpose also has to be more developed in the public. I think people don't realize. People don't, for example, necessarily see that extraction of coal is a big issue, and it would generate problems that don't appear immediately. People don't see that certain kinds of employment may appear in the short run as desirable, but actually in the medium term even are extremely undesirable. So it's a combination of generating awareness, creating more mobilization around specific issues, recognizing that the trade-offs are not the same as those that are presented, and then demanding greater transparency and accountability from our states as well. All very, very big issues, all tall order. I'm not saying it's all simple. But I don't think we can say that, we can't say private bad, public good, because it doesn't work that way. Power dominates in both of these. And the point is to generate enough power on the other side.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Our next question, I think I'll have one for Tejal and then back to Sagar. I think Tejal, this kind of touches on what you mentioned around equity. And the question is, why do you think equity is usually ignored? Very broad question. Yeah,
I mean, it depends on what kind of equity you're talking about, which is ignored. Not all, there is, for example, like I mentioned, the WTO negotiations, there they speak about equality. They say if we have to cut subsidies, you have to cut subsidies too. And if there's, our farmers don't get subsidies, your farmers don't get subsidies too. So there is, so we have to be very careful when we use this terminology. But in the climate change debate specifically, inter-country, inter-regional equity is, there's always a push. That's been a very contentious issue. There's always a push by the developed countries, by what are known as the Annex 1 countries under the UNFCCC, to leave the issue out of the discussions, to try and sort of not talk about historical emissions. There's a lot of grandfathering of past emissions. And there is a lot of support that kind of argument actually gets, even from scholars of the Global South, because they think that what is really important is intergenerational equity. So if intergenerational equity is important, we shouldn't keep harping on. I mean, I've been accused of, really living in some other era. We are, 30 years ago, and you're talking about the third world, the Global South, etc. Those debates don't matter anymore. We are staring at a 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise. What are you talking about? Equity between nations, etc. We should be talking about equity between generations. That's really important. And my argument is that, it's fine for developed countries that have achieved a certain level of development of material wealth, also material well-being, really, to think about it in these terms. For us, not dealing with, not addressing intra-generational equity within our people, between nations, means that this equity gets reproduced across generations. We've seen this happen in our country across multiple axes of inequality, that it gets reproduced because it does not get addressed within a generation. And it's not, I'm not saying that it gets addressed, if we address it within a generation, we don't have to deal with it, but I'm saying that it is equally important. And part of the reason, everybody's spoken about power and things like that. It is political. Climate change, why, if you're thinking about it in terms of climate science, if you're thinking about it in terms of climate policy, economics, etc., it is an intensely political subject. You should, all of us, in fact, should be very cognizant of it and see it as such. And so therefore, there are different ways. If we are talking about equity between nations, we've been speaking about South-South cooperation, speaking across. Why do we only have to, there's an article today in the Indian Express that how, because Biden is now elected in the US, how India should try and talk to Biden and get a treaty like Zai did when, Obama, before Trump came to power and things like that. So why are we still hell-bent on talking to the United States? That's really a really big bully and has done nothing. It's a laggard in terms of climate action. We should actually be talking across, to countries that are more like us, that have the same interests that we have. We've really not done this. We tried doing this with the emerging economies, with Brazil. We had the basic, Brazil, South Africa, China, etc. But none of these countries are really like us. They've gone much ahead to where we are. We really fall with the least developed countries on a lot of these issues, but we are unwilling to think of ourselves as such. We want to be with the big boys. We want to be at the G20. We want to think of ourselves like that. And so we are really being blind to the problems of our own populations, and by not, and we are really harming our interests by not talking to countries that are really like us, and that also will benefit from the fact that whatever said and done, even though we are a developing country, we have certain capabilities that we have developed because of a certain history that we had of developing institutions, scientific institutions, etc., in the country. So, it's a very long answer. I don't have a specific answer of why it is ignored, but these are at the governmental level, other than things that have been said, mass movements, etc. The governmental level, I think this is something that we should think about really carefully.
All right, thank you. So I've lost electricity here, so I'm just going to continue. My next question is for Sagar. A key understanding within the environmental space is the concept of the tipping point or a non-equilibrium point of no return, and how adequate has economics been in representing this? So I think we have time for 2 other questions after this, but yes, thank you, Sagar. Over to you.
Well, to whatever extent I have seen literature in economics, and like I said, I don't scan literature in economics, as much as I do in certain other subjects. Both on the question, there is, in fact, on the whole problem of peak oil, which is a term used to generally describe the problem of resource depletion and resource exhaustion, both of non-renewable ores as well as fossil fuels. There's actually very little attention being paid to it. In fact, if you even scan journals like EPW, there's very little writing. The only journal I know in India which is readily willing to publish is, in fact, Frontier in India. No one is willing to touch these things. In fact, some of my friends who write on the subject and I have had articles rejected by leading journals and magazines and so on this subject. Now, this is something that, in fact, I fear much more than climate change, because since I have been basically in professionally in the business of risk mitigation, um, anything that hits you suddenly is you don't have the time really to respond. Climate change is bad, but you still have some time, to respond to things. If 5 crore Bangladeshis are going to become homeless by the end of this century, you still have some time. You need the will, of course, to do something about it. But if you have an energy crash, you don't have the time. And so I have not seen, leave aside writings in economics. In fact, I have not seen writings even in other disciplines which deal with these kind of issues as to what do you do with tipping points? How do you deal with them? There's just not enough literature on this. Not even enough, in fact, discussion in international fora, international conferences and things of this sort. It's just inadequate, in fact, the whole thing. So, which is why we need a lot more discussion on this. And that's why, in fact, some of us say that we need to turn government's attention from gain maximization for a few to risk minimization for all. Not just government, people and governments around the world. And that is an attempt that some of us are trying to do right now by filing, because of lack of other avenues, by filing PILs in the Supreme Court, not just on the EIA issue, but also on the recent floods on COVID and so on, saying that, listen, you've just not paid enough attention to these things. In spite of the fact that the Bhopal Gas Act foregrounds itself by saying that I invoke the legal doctrine of what they call parents patrae. That is, I will behave as your parent. That's what government said in 1985 when it enacted the Bhopal Gas Act. My question is, if so, then why did you abandon me when the tsunami happened and you had a 2-hour notice, in fact, before it hit the Tamil Nadu and Andhra coast, because it hit the Andamans 2 hours earlier and we lost 10,000 people. Why did you abandon the people in Ersama, the 1999 cyclone? You had ISRO satellite images, which I have, in fact, which told you 3 days in advance, where landfall was going to happen, and 50,000 people died. Why did you abandon us in the Bhuj earthquake, and so on? So we need to turn people's attention around that increasingly more budget will have to be allocated to risk minimization, which means that food and water have to become fundamental rights, and environmental protection will have to become a fundamental duty, health must become a fundamental right, and so on and so forth. I won't get into all those details, but we do have a small team of lawyers, scientists, bureaucrats, retired bureaucrats, etc., working on these issues now, journalists and so on, trying to turn attention around to that risk minimization is the main job that government must do, not gain maximization for a few.
All right. Thank you, Sagar. So I don't think we have much time. So I have one last question. This is for Jayati. So what kind of needs to be done for the economics discipline? And is ecological economics the only answer? I think that was more the question.
This is a very big question. I think some of the things that I think need to be done for economics, I had mentioned in the opening comments. I don't think that, just having a separate stream of ecological is a solution to anything, or it's the right way to go. Nor do I, just like I don't think that, saying, well, I'm in a stream that is economics of gender or feminist economics. I don't believe in the stream approach, because that tends to create the silos and the ghettos, and it creates economists who are willing to be obsessed with the macroeconomic policies for fiscal stabilization, etc., without thinking about the broader consequences overall. So yes, I think much more work is required in ecological economics. I don't believe that a discipline can simply say, well, we've got some people doing ecological economics, and we've got some people doing economics of care, and we've got some people doing something. I don't think that is the best thing to do. I think what is required is for the discipline itself to actually go through a fundamental restructuring and reorientation and new way of looking at things, where you actually start questioning a lot of the concepts that have formed the basis of our economic understanding for a very long time. And so, yeah, I don't think the discipline has responded adequately so far. I think there are signs, especially that young people are forcing it to change more and more. But it doesn't mean that you then head off and say, I just do that. It means that you force the rest of the discipline to actually take all of these things into account. Having said that, it's also true that all of these things are very complex, and there's a lot of debate and discussion around each of these. I mean, Sagar mentioned peak oil. There's a huge debate and discussion about this, which needs to be looked at carefully and assessed without necessarily everybody becoming an expert in this. But each of these definitely needs significant and detailed research and understanding and discussion within it. But the results that you get also need to inform the broader discipline. And that's where I think economics really has to change. That's why I think rethinking economics is a terrific idea. And when we rethink, we have to rethink fundamentally. It not simply say, I'm going to do this little branch of it, which is good. But we have to completely change the way in which we are assessing things that appear unrelated, but actually are strongly affected by nature, by the energy use, by the distributional consequences, by the global architecture, and so on. I don't think that's a particularly great answer, but that's really broadly what I would say on this. Yeah.
No, I think that was brilliant. I think that was a good sum up to like the sort of the conversation, what we need to take from it. But before we close today, I think just want to thank all the panelists for coming and taking out time. And I'd also sort of like to mention that we have 2 other events coming up under the same series. We have a workshop on Tuesday together, which we've organized together with Oikos International. And we have 2 other sessions next Saturday, one on industry and the second on policy, sort of focusing on their responses to the climate crisis. And a short introduction to both the organizers. One, the Rethink Economics India Network, which is a national network of the global Rethink Economics movement. And we kind of are a network of students, academics, and professionals trying to build a better economics for society and the classroom. And this session was co-organized with the Pali Project, which is a student-led initiative that focuses on research-driven solutions for a global agenda. They started in 2020, and the project aims to be a platform where students can voice their opinions and understanding the world around them. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you to our organizers. And I think have a great weekend and hope to see all of you attendees again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.